Welcome to Modern Domestics' My Bernette Virtual Machine Owner class. I'm Erica, and in part 6, we're going to talk about how to navigate your machine and select stitches. Let's review how to select and change your stitches and stitch settings. For the sew and go, you'll start by raising your presser foot. Turn your hand wheel toward you to raise your needle until the take-up lever is visible at the top of your machine. Next, turn your stitch selector dial to the straight stitch with the needle in the center. Turn your stitch length dial to 2.5 millimeter. Place your fabric under the presser foot and use the lever to lower it down. Press on your foot control to start sewing. And to backstitch, hold down your reverse button for a few stitches at the beginning and end of your seam. You can change the stitch length with your stitch length dial, and you can move your dial to select different stitches. So go ahead and try a zigzag stitch, and you can change the length on that if you'd like. And you're going to use this same method to select your other stitches. So you're going to use the stitch selector dial to select the stitch and your stitch length dial to change the length. The setup is quite similar for the 33 and 35 models. You can consult your manual for detailed help, which has a comprehensive list of all the stitches the machine can do, as well as recommendations for the settings. With stitch A selected, turn your stitch length dial to 2.5 millimeter. Place your fabric under the presser foot, lower it down, and press your foot pedal to begin to sew. Use your reverse lever to backstitch at the beginning of your seam, and then you can sew all the way down to the end and use that lever to backstitch again, and this will lock your seams in place. Now try selecting stitch C, the zigzag stitch. Adjust the length with the stitch length dial and practice sewing this stitch. To access your additional stitch patterns, select your desired stitch with the stitch selector dial and select the red S on the stitch length dial. If these stitches look irregular, you can adjust them by moving the dial toward the plus or minus on either side of the S to recalibrate the stitch. So in this example, you can see what a difference it made to adjust that dial. For the 37 and 38 models, stitch selection looks a little different. Go ahead and put your fabric under your presser foot and lower the presser foot down. You can begin to sew, and you're going to use the reverse button on the front of the machine in order to backstitch at the beginning of your seam. You can use your slider to control your speed by moving it left and right. As you get closer to the end of your seam, you can use the securing button to sew some securing stitches in order to lock your seam in place. Use the thread cutter on the side of the machine to cut your threads, and then slide open the tray on the front of the machine, and you're going to access your stitch card. Use the up arrow to select stitch 5 for the zigzag stitch, and then use the right arrow to select stitch width, and you can see that it's underlined, and that's how you know that you're accessing that particular piece. And then the one next to that to the right of it is stitch length. To access larger numbers, go ahead and underline the stitch number and then use the arrows to change each number. For the 38, you're going to use the arrows on the left and right for width and then length underneath, and then clear will take you back to the factory setting for that stitch. And you can see as you cycle through each button, it's going to show you on screen what that particular stitch is going to look like and what the settings are for that stitch. If you hit mode, it's going to take you to various folders with different stitches saved in them. On the front of your machine, you've got your start-stop button, reverse, securing button, needle up down, thread cutter, and your double needle. And then you've also got your slider for your speed control. For the 77 and 79 machines, you'll adjust your stitch settings via touchscreen. Lower the presser foot onto the fabric with the presser foot button. Sew a few stitches forward. Then you're going to hold your reverse button in to backstitch and secure your seam. Continue sewing to the end of your seam, and then as an alternative to the reverse button, you could use the securing button, which will sew a series of securing stitches in place, just tying a knot with the thread. You can use the cutter button to cut your threads. And then use your stylus to make stitch selections on your touch screen. You can see when you choose a different stitch, the touchscreen will show what your stitches will look like. You can use the stitch width and stitch length dials to alter the stitch settings, and you'll see your changes right on screen. You can also save your changes to your favorites if you think you might want to use those settings again. So you're hitting the heart and then that middle folder and then the green checkbox. And then to access those later, you'll just go to the heart, press that top box with the folder, and then select which saved stitch you want. And then you're ready to sew. Just like with the other models I've talked about, your manual for the Academy has a list of all the stitches the machine can do, as well as recommended settings for each stitch. You're going to go ahead and make sure your needle is raised to its highest position, and then you're going to turn the stitch selector dial to the stitch that you want. For the straight stitch, just select stitch A. You'll adjust your stitch length to 2.5 millimeter, and you'll adjust your stitch width to 0. For the zigzag stitch, you're going to select stitch B and adjust your stitch length to 2 millimeter, and you can change your stitch width to 4 millimeter. You can adjust your length as you go in order to create a denser stitch by lowering the number. To select your secondary stitches, move the stitch selector dial to your desired stitch letter, and then you're going to move the stitch length dial to the red S for your secondary 1 stitches. Adjust your width as needed, and for your secondary 2 stitches, move the stitch length dial to the gray S2 and adjust your width as needed again. Thanks for watching this video. In part 7, we're going to talk about cleaning and oiling your machine. See you then.